Good evening, everyone. It's 6 p.m. It's time for the fifth edition of the Climate Justice Charter Movement webinar series. We've brought you 4 webinars unpacking a variety of issues affecting people in South Africa and around the world because the ecological crisis connects us all. And today we'll be talking about the sanctity of human nature. Before we get into this very specific topic, I want to tell you a little bit about the Climate Justice Charter. There's an organization called the South African Food Sovereignty Center, working with the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center for about 6 years. And then last year, we launched the Climate Justice Charter movement, spearheaded by the Climate Justice Charter. It was launched in Parliament in October last year, and the movement began organizing for this charter. So what is this charter? It's a plan to address hunger, thirst, pollution, climate breakdown, the ecological crisis facing all of us here in South Africa. Communities across the country got together to workshop, to build this charter in ways that serve different forms of justice: climate justice, economic justice, and intergenerational justice. And in some ways, we can talk about faith-based justice based on today's conversation. We want you to support our charter. You can just click on the petition, which is going to be sent in the chat. And about 6,000 individuals have signed, and you can join on as well and help ensure that Parliament brings an end to water problems, hunger, and pollution in South Africa, really important issues that we're experiencing. You can also endorse as an organization. We also appeal to you to share the petition with your friends, with your family, with anyone who you think should join our movement and support this sort of campaign. And we think that's about everyone, really. The Climate Justice Charter movement is for everyone. The next thing we want you to do is ask some questions about at past, after we've had a short conversation with the panelists. You can just prepare some questions that you want to ask and let us know, what you think about the discussion or any kind of questions you have for the people who are going to be our discussants this evening. So before I get into tonight's discussants, I always read a short section from the charter. Today, because our discussion was about, a faith perspective, I was trying to think about which section of the charter to read from. And I think the most appropriate section of the charter to read from is the preamble. So I'm just going to read you a few sections of this sort of the philosophy underlying the Climate Justice Charter. As Africans, we live together on a vast and beautiful continent where the human story began. All of us are linked to the first human who walked upright, dreamed, thought, and coexisted with plants, animals, rivers, oceans, and forests. Today, this common humanity and its future is in serious danger. South Africa cannot ignore this challenge. The continued use of oil, gas, and coal to power our economy and society is making our world unlivable for all life. The earth is being damaged by this system that puts profits before life. Every year, temperatures are rising, with disastrous consequences. With a 1 degree Celsius increase in planetary temperature since the start of the Industrial Revolution, everything is changing fast. Increasing extreme weather shocks, droughts, floods, wildfires, tornadoes, and heat waves, ecosystem collapse, sea level rise, together with major stresses on the Earth's systems. We are sad because a future with a stable climate is being lost. Our recent drought just taught us that lesson. We are angry because our rulers are not listening. Inequality and suffering of our people, including during the COVID-19 pandemic, has worsened. Yet, we are hopeful because climate science is on our side. Like the science of COVID-19, climate science is calling for caring action now. This charter is a call to all who care about human and non-human life to act together in advancing a plurivision of people's dreams, alternatives, and desires for a deep, just transition. I thought that was powerful, especially based on the kind of conversation we'll be having this evening about faith-based perspectives on nature and the climate crisis. It seemed that the sanctity of nature is what is communicated in that preamble. So who will be joining us this evening? We're going to be joined by Francesca de Gasparis and Gabriel Manyangadze. So Francesca is the director of SAFC, which is an organization connecting faith-based communities to address the ecological crisis. And Gabriel is that organization's climate justice coordinator. Good evening, and thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
Good evening, Tshiamo. Thank you very much for inviting us.
So I suppose, my question, the question for many people, we want to know what's the relationship between faith and the climate crisis? They seem like two very different things. So what connects them?
Thanks, Tshiamo. It's such a privilege to be here with you and Jane and everyone who's attending and to be part of this discussion. I hope it will be a discussion with the other participants, because the way that SAFC views that question is really in this pluralistic approach. We are a multi-faith NGO or an environmental NGO, and we believe that it is in our collective faiths and our collective wisdom, expansive from a science-based approach to the climate crisis into our knowledge of the cosmos, how we understand the world and our relationship with each other and every other living and non-living thing on Earth, that really helps us. And you can hear that in the preamble, that expansive language that's used. You can hear how it's stretching out from just quite a rigid science analysis of climate science, climate crisis, how did we get here, how did we understand it, to incorporate other knowledge systems. So if you ask a person who works with the land, they can tell you how they've seen the climate crisis having impact. And if you ask a faith leader, how do they see the climate crisis? You know that there's a deep reverence, a deep connection to the earth, to our Mother Earth, to the sanctity of life. And all faiths talk of that. All faiths talk of the golden rule, do unto another as you do unto yourself. So when we talk about the climate crisis and we talk about faith, for SAFC, and for all of us, in fact, I mean, in our region, in Southern Africa, where SAFC works, about 80%, some people say 90% of people who live here have a faith. Some people have, they're part of an organized religion. Some people are part of traditional knowledge systems, indigenous faiths, which are really around an entire way of life. And some people are part of a spiritual connection with the earth. And all of that speaks to how do we relate to each other and how do we relate to the earth. So the climate crisis really calls to us and says to us, what can we do in crisis as people of faith? What do we do? And what do our sacred texts tell us about crisis? There's many stories and examples in the sacred texts, all the sacred texts, about what humans did when they were faced with an absolute crisis. And so, of course, faith is absolutely connected to the climate crisis. We can look back into knowledge that has come over the eons from our ancestors, which can help guide us. And we can also look at current texts and see what they are saying. So I know that my colleague Gabriel, it's so wonderful to be with him here this evening, was going to tell us a little bit more about some of the texts of faith and the climate crisis and share something. So Gabriel and I would like to, if it's all right, share the questions amongst us because we each have contributions to make.
Oh, that's perfect, yeah.
Great, I'm gonna hand over then, thanks.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for that introduction. Tshiamo, I would want to quickly point out to what Gary Gardner actually said about the issues of faith. First, faith can engage members, and for some denomination, we are looking at very large numbers of people who actually come on board. Therefore, when we are talking about faith and the climate crisis, we are actually talking to the majority of people who actually hold a faith, and they would want to listen and they would want to be part of the solution to this crisis. Secondly, faith actually draws more moral authority to address climate change, and such authority is held by religious leaders in all faiths, as well as from the different respected sacred faith texts that they actually bring on board, as was mentioned earlier by Francesca. We also have faith providing a meaning and shaping the worldviews, and the faith message or set of values related to protecting environment can provide a platform for discussing the climate change issues. And this is very critical because this happens on a day-to-day basis within our faith as we interact with our faith. And maybe on the last part, we also have the faith communities have a tremendous potential for building the social capital to respond to the climate change crisis. as would be said by some of the faiths, for instance, the Buddhist temples have also initiated alternative energy projects. You can actually find this, that they've led in the energy projects in India, in Japan, in Canada, as well as in Australia, in their different temples. So this energy crisis is something that faith has responded to in all its dimensions. Thank you very much.
I suppose I want to jump onto that, Gabriel and Francesca. Both of you mentioned faith communities, a majority of South Africans being South Africans of faith. And you've also mentioned some initiatives that faith-based communities have done. I mean, you can look at churches hosting food kitchens for hungry people, etc. What I want to know is, does this message resonate? What is it about faith-based messages that makes it resonate so much with people that the ecological crisis is something that we interpret into our sacred texts? Francesca mentioned a bit earlier that we've dealt with crises for such a long time that this is the next crisis to deal with. Do you think there's something about being a person of faith that puts you up to the task to dealing with the ecological crisis?
I think that the people of faith have a role to play. I think that people of faith often are willing and interested to ask very deep questions of themselves, of their faith, of their God, in whatever form they believe that to be, and of society. So I think that people of faith often ask some of the very deep questions we need to ask ourselves, and try and inculcate the kinds of deep social change that we need to address climate crisis. Of course, one can't only address climate crisis from self or communal levels. That is a very important place, and that's a very important place that faith people can act. But we're also looking at structural issues. And there, faith leaders also have a moral authority. One of the issues that we found in the debates or dialogues around climate change is that some people have said, oh, well, science doesn't say it's an absolute. Or science is always sort of looking back and saying, yes, that was climate change, but isn't able to predict with certainty. And one of the freedoms that coming from a faith perspective gives you is you can say, I can see that the direction we're going in is not the direction that we must go in. Actually, there's something morally wrong about this. And there's something about this that actually speaks to who we are. It's easy to see. It's a much more direct relationship. You don't have to wait for a scientist to tell you you're going in the wrong direction. No, you can, in your own personal relationship with the world, say, hey, this isn't right. And that's a very sort of immediate personal relationship between you and the world. And then, of course, the actions that you take, yes, you can challenge structural issues like government decision-making. You can do a veggie garden. There's lots of things you can do as a person of faith. And Gabriel may also want to add on that.
Thank you, Francesca. Maybe the Abrahamic faith, that is the Jewish, the Christians, and the Muslims, would agree with what you have just said, Francesca, that when the earth was created, the Almighty said, it is good. But would we say the same statement today? It helps us to ponder and think, is this what we really want to have? And when we say no, then it follows as people of faith. There's something that we have to do. There is an action that I have to take at a personal level, and also to encourage others with me in the community to actually act accordingly, so that together, as you have mentioned in your preamble, Tshiamo, that we are all in it. And unfortunately, we also bring with us maybe into this crisis the other part of the living earth, the animals as well as the plants all around us, which may not be able to act in the manner that we do. And it is us as the stewards of the earth that we are supposed to actually take it up and act. Thank you.
No, I like these responses. I like the connection between faith and science. I like that really powerful statements about looking at whether the earth is good and then doing something about that. Speaking about the structural responses and the various actions we take, I've seen SAFC is really strong on a multi-faith approach. Francesca, you mentioned a bit about that earlier. I just want to understand, how do we implement this multi-faith approach? In what ways do we ensure that various different people of variety of faiths interact with each other for this issue, for this activism, for this approach, for making the earth good?
Thank you, Tshiamo. That's such a good question. And it's one that we ponder a lot, because we believe that asking ourselves these important questions helps us to keep expanding our understanding. And I want to talk a little bit about where SAFC started from. SAFC was started in 2005 by Bishop Jeff Davies and Kate Davies, an environmental educator and a bishop from the Anglican Church. And they had seen over time how there was this disconnect between the scriptures and our understanding and our connection with environmental issues. So they brought together right from the beginning a multi-faith approach. And why was that? Because they felt that in each faith, there is this sacred text which speaks about the relationship with the environment. And there was a common message there that was getting lost in modern society. And they chose the word multi-faith because, and this is how I understand it, but I know others in the audience and who are listening may also have other perspectives on it. But how I understand it is multi-faith means we can stand together in our own faith belief and work together on an issue. We don't have to necessarily entirely agree about the scriptural meanings, or we don't have to even entirely understand why this is sacred to you as it is to me, but together we can work collectively on an issue. The interfaith dialogues, which we now also do, are very important also because it allows you to understand each other's faiths. And one of the wonderful benefits of SAFC's work is a greater understanding and tolerance of other faiths. And we know that faith has often been very much linked to conflict in the world. Even now, today, we see that going on. So we believe finding right action, good action together as people of faith allows us really to break down the barriers and to find ways to engage with each other that are positive, that really are affirming, and let us understand and appreciate the diversity of life in the human family as well as the rest of the world.
And I suppose that connects to something you wrote about in your Daily Maverick article about how this approach that SAFC takes is very different than fundamental or political approaches. Do you sometimes have these kind of tensions, Gabriel, with people who have a lot more fundamental beliefs, who maybe want to steer the direction away from a multi-faith approach or from the way in which SAFC is operating? How do we address challenges like that amongst people who might be a bit more political or a bit more fundamental?
Our approach basically is the one that wants to take everybody on board. One that has a deeper understanding that every living person is important. Every living thing on earth is important, and it does contribute towards our collective well-being. And therefore, in our approach, we would look at the issues that surround just transition. And I'll basically want to put forward about 3 things that we would need to actually take into perspective as we deal with the issues that surround this change. And these will be the principles that set within our different faith, as well as the principles that help us to deal with all the crises that we encounter in our lives. And these have to be just principles, and these have to be also the principles that will take us to a higher level. They have to be the second part, which is the processes that we need to look into that bring about the deep justice transition, a change that is permanent, a change that will make us to be on a good platform. And lastly, we would also talk about the practices that we should be sustainable and would lead to a life that when we look back, would all say we have done well. And maybe, as I referred to earlier on, would say, maybe we are not there where God left us, but we are trying to go back to when he said it is good.
I suppose, this 3-based approach also connects with a concept that you wrote about in the article called Ecotheology. Now, I must admit, I don't know too much about ecotheology. I imagine many of the listeners also aren't that familiar with this concept. What exactly is ecotheology?
Thank you very much, Tshiamo. When we are talking about eco-theology, I think as you would see, we have we can actually say those are the two phrases put together. One with a direct reference to the ecology or the environment that we live in, and the theology, which in an essence refers to that dealing which we have, or the study or the understanding that we have with the Almighty. Would say ecotheology is a form of constructive theology that focuses on the interrelationships of the faith and nature, particularly in the light of the environmental concerns. And we'll also be looking at ecology generally, starting from the premise that relationships exist between the human, the religious, and the faith worldviews. And also when we are looking at the impact and effect that the human has on the environment. And I would think Francesca would also want to add on to the issues of ecotheology. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Gabriel. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting emerging area, Tshiamo. And I think one of the things that's so wonderful about ecotheology is it's making sense of really what we were talking about, that connection between religion and the environment, and really expanding that and seeing what is there that we can understand better. So there's a lot of academics and others who, this is their career. It's a really interesting field where there's a lot of reading you could do, very ecumenical. There's a lot of groups that are working on this, including in South Africa. And it does inform our work because these are people who are doing deeper dives. And I also want to say on the issue of the fundamentalism is that we are seeing, yes, there are some faiths who have a sort of an ideology which is politically oriented, in sort of not wanting to accept some science-based facts that that is common in society, such as climate change and other issues. But we're finding actually that in many faiths, including a big part of the evangelical movement, there's a lot of interest and deep knowledge and engagement in climate change. So I think there are some fundamental approaches which may advocate for violence because of ideological reasons. But I would say that almost all faiths are interested, when they look at their text and when they look at the crisis that we're facing, they're interested in dealing with that because they see their people suffering and what can you do about that. So I would say there has been a shift actually towards an acceptance of climate change in many parts of the world. Certainly in Africa, there's a tremendous common understanding about the impact of climate change and what we need to do about it.
Well, I'm also hoping, Francesca, that a lot of these people can be reached, not by abandoning a science-based approach, but by also working together with faith-based communities like your own to also give a really strong faith-based messaging. I mean, I love what Gabriel said earlier about, is the earth good as it was made to be good? And, just asking communities that sort of a question and the answer being, actually, maybe there are some things that we can do, and then bump them with the climate science. I do want to ask, we've been talking about the earth being good. What does that mean for the earth to be good? I suppose many of us want to know, what is the sanctity of nature?
Oh, well, walking lightly on the planet, that this is all sacred all around us, that you and I and everyone on this call and everything here is sacred, that heaven isn't something up above, but actually we live in our sacred place already. And how do we treat that place? How then do we interact with each other? How then do we understand what that means? And And what then does it mean for us in terms of how we live our lives, that we're not waiting for the pearly gates, but rather we're here and now with each other, trying to live in a sacred connection with each other. So yeah, what does it mean? It's a good question. Gabriel, what is your reflections on that?
Okay, when we are looking at the sanctity of nature, we are looking at the beginning, that God gave to us this as a gift that we are supposed to treasure, and a gift that we are sharing with other living beings, that is the grass, the plants, the animals. And therefore, the sanctity of nature would mean we would do unto others as we would want them to do unto us, as was mentioned earlier on by Francesca. We need to respect the seas around us. We need to respect the animals around us. We need to respect all the biodiversity that surrounds us and make our lives complete. They do shape our lives as much as we influence theirs. And it is therefore this interrelationship of life and nature that we should actually take forward and actually respect. And in the Muslim faith, they actually look at it and say, all beings actually worship and give glory to the Almighty. And as they do that, we cannot disturb other lives when they are giving worship and glory to the Almighty. And this is when we actually look at the sanctity of life and say, we can do our part as the human beings and respect other beings that are also living on earth with us. And most of the different faiths also have a similar issue to the ones that we are looking at. When we look at the Buddhist teachings and practices, we also look at the issues where they are saying we are supposed to have the guidelines that would say, do no harm to the others that you live with. And the central law of conditioned interdependence and causations that reflects in a system or a holistic or ecological worldview. So with this, we would feel we need to be part of a respecting living world where all life should respect other lives for us to be able to move forward. And that would be the sanctity of life that we are talking about. Thank you, Tshiamo.
I think that's a very cohesive answer. And I think for most people, the idea that nature needs to have some level of sanctity is shared among us. If you're attending the webinar and you have any particular question about this evening's discussion about faith-based communities and their connection to the ecological crisis, you can just put a message into the chat box here and I'll ask the question to the panelists. So I want to ask another question, speaking more directly about the various aspects of the ecological crisis. So I saw in the Daily Maverick article, you took a very interesting approach. So we've been speaking about one of the approaches, which is to look at the ecological crisis as a form of disruption. The earth that is good, the earth that is meant to have sanctity has been disrupted. So it's about a regenerative or a restorative approach. The second approach I've noticed you've taken is a very human-focused approach. So for instance, looking at the use of herbicides and pesticides in large-scale agricultural farming, you've said, oh, well, that has a human impact on people's lives. So I wonder if you want to expand more on that, if that message is very responsive for people, how we connect the faith-based message to pollution and how pollution affects people or people that lose access to water, not just looking at it as a structural issue, although you're right, Francesca, that these are structural issues, decisions that governments are making on large corporations. But I thought it was really interesting that you spoke a lot about humanity. So I wanted to know more about your thoughts on that kind of approach. And, is that very deliberate? Is there this deliberate message from faith-based communities to speak about human beings and not just like the ecological crisis as an abstract concept, which is usually what might happen in a science-based approach?
It's a really interesting question, Tshiamo. We do think that human beings and some of our theory of change, NGOs like to have a theory of change, So what is it that we want to see happen in the world? And our theory of change does see humans and the human, the individual, the self, as having a very important role as an agent of change. I hope you can all hear me, because my internet's a little bit on and off this evening, but
you're very clear, Francesca.
Okay. So yeah, so it is about in the self. So I mean, yes, we have a structural analysis, and yes, we do. You know, we have our court case that with Earth Life Africa, we took the government to court over the nuclear deal that was declared illegal and unconstitutional by the courts. So we do the big structural things, but we do believe that the agent of change needs to be in the individual. And I think it comes back to faith, because it's often about a personal relationship. And so we like to ground our work in the individual, yes. But what we do as a collective, I think, is very powerful. If I'm understanding your question correctly, and maybe Gabriel also has some thoughts on that. But I think you were saying, why do we base it in humanity versus, you know, sort of the more abstract things? But yeah, I think we like to think of it as being around agency, having agency. What can we do? Not feeling sort of, it's a justice approach in the sense that we want people to feel that there's something they can do, because we believe that is in fact the way that change happens in the world. So yeah, it's very much a grounding in that relationship and in hearing from others, because I think you also have seen from the young climate activists that we've got emerging in the last few years, they are really coming with incredible solutions and ideas. And so, you know, if the youth felt disabled by just focusing on the economic issues to do with climate change, they wouldn't necessarily feel that there was something they could do as an individual. So yeah, absolutely. I think it is starting with the self.
Gabriel sounds like you just, I co-sign, I agree.
Yes, maybe just to add the other dimension of the element of the stewardship of the human being. From the different phases that we have mentioned, you find we take the human being as the steward. And as a steward, you have a responsibility to others and to the one that is also given you the stewardship on earth. So it is with this element of stewardship that now we are questioning ourselves as the human race to say, are we being good stewards to the environment that was bestowed on us so that we would enjoy it together with other living beings? And when we ask that question, we then center on the solution that hence the human being has to take to be the one responsible for this, and to make sure that we correct the wrongs that we have done as the human beings or as the human race. And that in itself actually is found in also most of the other texts that would say the element of oneness and interdependence has to affect us and has to drive us to do things in a way that would sort to make sure that everybody on the living earth would have their space and be able to live life in its fullness.
I like this, you know, steward-based response, sort of looking at us as all caretakers of the earth. I suppose we should get into some very, very specifics. Let's say I am a person of faith living somewhere in the country. I'm part of some denomination. How do I start up, you know, fighting the ecological crisis within my church? What are the sort of things I suggest? What do I say to the religious leader in my community? How can I get involved with SAFC? How can I get my denomination connected to SAFC? So if someone's really interested in bringing their faith community into the activism, what are the sort of steps they should take?
Thank you, Ben. You can go ahead, Francesca.
Are you sure? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gabriel. There are so many things you can do. Obviously, we are on social media channels. That's a very easy way for people to connect with us. We've also got a newsletter. So there are ways you can start following us and engaging with us. We also, on our newsletter and on our social media channels, often have calls for people of faith to join us on particular issues if you're interested in a particular thing. We also offer some trainings and webinars. We also have webinars where we do deeper dives into different issues, including the interfaith dialogues that I mentioned earlier. We recently had an interfaith dialogue, which was fascinating, on how to have a green funeral. And that was something where we have a multi-faith panel, different faiths offering their perspectives on it. And it's really interesting. The sorts of things that you learn. I mean, we're always learning, which is one of the things that we enjoy, is that we're always learning from each other. And we learn from the people of faith who join us. So we are very much during COVID times doing online meetings. Sometimes we do face-to-face if protocols can be observed and it's logistically possible, but we're doing lots online at the moment. And yeah, so there's lots of ways to engage with us. We've also got our website, and we're actively campaigning on a number of issues at the moment. So if you're into joining a collective of faith, people of faith speaking out on certain issues, that's possible. We've got a campaign to try and stop more nuclear energy for South Africa, stop the extension of the Koeberg power plant, which is a disaster sitting on our doorstep here in Cape Town. We've also got a campaign around animal welfare, which is specifically looking at cages and how cruel they are, not only to the animals, but also to us who have to then eat these creatures or their products that are manufactured in such an inhumane way. It's extremely unhealthy for us as well as the environment and the animals. And we also have a campaign at the moment, which I'm going to leave Gabriel to talk about because it's actually his campaign. So I'm going to hand over to you, Gabriel.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Yes, there are a lot of things that people can do at an individual level and at a local level. We have mentioned that we need to look at ourselves as people who do no harm to other living things. And that also is one thing that we can do at an individual level. On a day-to-day basis, I think we should take stock of what we are doing and check on the things that we are using and find out whether we are not doing any harm to the other living beings that are around us or that surround us. But going into the issue that Francesca mentioned, we have a campaign where we are looking at industrial agriculture and what it is actually doing to the environment. And as SAFC, we are saying we should actually be very concerned about industrial agriculture, in particular when there is the use of excessive chemicals that destroys biodiversity. And to this end, we have even written a letter, a public letter, to the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, where we are saying the manner and approach that is actually happening in terms of the production is not sustainable, and in a way it is destroying the environment. And we have even written to the supporters of this project, that is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, so that we are saying, please redirect your energy towards sustainable agricultural practices, one that are regenerative, one that would lead to communities having food on their table without damaging or destroying the environment in which they are actually living. And it is also our approach that we look at the issues that surround the science as well as the indigenous knowledge systems, so that together each one of us can take a part in terms of making sure that we are living on an earth that we are going to leave to the next generation, because we owe it to them. Thank you, Tshiamo.
Yeah, we have a comment, unfortunately not a question. It says, thank you for the wonderful explanation of walking lightly on our earth, Gabriel. And yes, as people who are sensitive to our needs to care for the environment, and as health workers, we are committed to first do no harm. The ethic of care is an enormous and exciting subject, tiny actions and gigantic concepts. I suppose then a lot of the work that you're doing, it's about effective communication of the ecological crisis. Because I mean, even in the way that you've communicated through this webinar, someone has connected your language, the way you're expressing yourself, to medical principles, you know, like not doing harm. I suppose then you could call this more than just a multi-faith perspective, but also a perspective that is human-based, that connects to the various needs that people face. I suppose before we close off, if we don't have many more questions from the public, I do want to talk a little bit about the structural issues. So we've been avoiding having that chat until now. Francesca's been bringing up some of the campaigns you've been running against nuclear power plants, taking the government to court about nuclear power facilities, which I suppose is an amazing initiative. So I want to know, you know, what SAFC's thinking here? Why is it so important that we fight these structural issues, and how do we make sure that we actually win?
Yeah, that's a big question, Tshiamo. And it's one that we have been trying to work on for many years already. I think what we see our role as being in society as an NGO is to monitor and also alert engaged citizens, faith leaders, people of faith about poor decision making that is happening. It's not just necessarily government, sometimes it's businesses and other big entities who have a big impact in South Africa and in the region. So we see our role as being about alerting people to issues, about translating sometimes overly technical, jargoned information that's done in legislative spaces that makes it almost impossible for someone who doesn't have a law degree to understand it. And not to say that we have a law degree, but some of us do, and some of us are able to help unpack and make accessible information to people. Because in a democracy, it is actually our duty. And people of faith get duty really well. It's like having rights and responsibilities go hand in hand, that it is a right, but also it's a responsibility to engage. Because democracy isn't something where you elect a leader and then they make all the right decisions. That once a person's in a leadership position, they will be bombarded with different thoughts and different motivations from different sectors. And if the business sector is the sector that screams loudest, you know, that's the direction that government ends up going in. So we need to remain engaged. And it's one of the reasons why we do the work that we do, because there are some issues which maybe aren't getting the attention that they should because there's so many other things happening. But like climate change, energy is an issue in South Africa where decisions that are being made today impact future generations. And it's very linked to climate change, as everyone knows. When we choose fossil fuels, we are committing ourselves and putting ourselves onto a dead-end road of rising temperatures, of huge impacts, which no one will be able to deal with. So energy is part of the climate crisis, but it's also part of the economic crisis. And the choices we make now and what's affordable to us, not just environmentally or in terms of health, but also in terms of future generations' opportunities. If we spend too much on fossil fuels or nuclear energy, we then won't have money to spend on education, on making sure that people have got adequate health care. And during a crisis like COVID, it's even more apparent how poor energy decision-making, like the idea of extending the life of Kuberg or investing in more fossil fuels, how deeply that will impact us. And that's why when we talk about a deep, just transition, we're not just talking about getting away from fossil fuels. If only it was that simple. It's actually about placing the well-being of people and planet at the center, so that actually people who are going to be without tomorrow, they will actually have an opportunity. Because people don't need handouts. What they need is an opportunity to educate themselves, to eat well, to have access to affordable electricity. These are our basic rights. And these are the things that actually are threatened when poor decision making is happening. So that's some of the structural stuff that we are trying to address in our work. And yeah, I mean, I really want to encourage people, if you're not part of SAFC, to come to some of our webinars. We have some really interesting conversations about that. It's not just me and Gabriel talking, many others. And we also like to have a bit more of a dialogue. So yeah, there's lots of interesting things going on there. And I don't know, Gabriel, if you want to talk a little bit more about some of the structural stuff around industrial agriculture as well.
Yes, when we are talking about the industrial agriculture, we also look at the issues that actually surround the use of chemicals, which is actually poisoning our biodiversity. And this is a very, very big concern, because not only does it affect the people that are there now, but it also tends to alter the biodiversity where these chemicals are being exposed to all the living things. And with that, the future that Francesca mentioned is not actually secured, because we don't know what is going to happen. A lot of people today inhaling the different chemicals, and later on you would find they will suffer different diseases. I think this dialogue has been going on in South Africa on the use of dangerous chemicals on industrial agriculture. And it is a concern to SAFC, because it damages the environment, and also it is very little consideration for the people that are affected by that. And with that, we also look at the control that the industrial agriculture has on certain processes that benefit the people or the small scale farmers. Like, for instance, the control of seed production, which then would also control the ability to actually live and be able to grow our own crops, or for the small older farmers to grow their own crops. They become sort of mortgaged to the system, which they are unable to actually pay. And that becomes also one of the biggest concerns that we have. And the use of some of the chemicals, as well as some of the chemical fertilizers, is an impact on the biodiversity as well, since it will actually become part and parcel of the environment. And it is a concern that we have raised as SAFC with the authorities, and also with some of those that support these processes. And I've mentioned earlier on the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which actually supports the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose all of this really speaks to the massive mountain we still have to overcome with these structural issues. But it's great to see that there's some level of support, SAFC being one of the organizations who just keep on pushing. I guess to conclude, I just want to find out, where do we go from here? So what's SAFC doing right now? What's the next big push?
Well, we are very pleased to be part of the Climate Justice Charter and part of that movement. It's really great to be working across sectors with others, academics, other NGOs, youth, the whole range of different people are involved in that space, and it's a really exciting space. And we know that there's still quite a few people who are trying to understand all these terms that we like to bandy around. So we continue to want to unpack language, climate language. We continue to encourage faith communities and faith leaders to join us. We are a network of people, and we are only as strong as everyone who's involved. So I want to say thanks to everyone who came to listen this evening, because there are some old friends and new friends in the audience, and it's always great to have an opportunity when people take time out of their busy lives to come and listen. So I just want to say thanks to you all for organizing this. And yeah, I mean, I think let's keep talking to each other. As much as we're not a talking shop, SAFC, we are very interested in seeing real ethical action on the ground in faith communities. So if you're interested in that, we are very interested in finding out what you're doing and finding ways that we can work together, because we do believe that taking action is really what we need to do now. So it's wonderful that we've had this opportunity to meet, and yeah, see what actions we're going to be taking next. I can see that Celeste very kindly posted that we've got an event coming up on the World Environment Day very soon in early June. And that will be a dialogue where you can talk about how you want to restore the earth. We're also involved in Green Faith International. So we're starting to look at the big climate change conference that's coming up at the end of the year, and what message we want to bring from Southern Africa, from faith communities to that. It's extremely important that we think long and hard. Apparently, finally, we're starting to hear loss and damage being mentioned by the UK government and others. So they're starting to seriously look at the impacts that climate change is already having here in the South. So yeah, lots more conversations about all these issues coming up soon.
Yeah, I do suppose we are in this very conversational aspect of it. And Bridget Nomonde actually commented in the chat, let's look at mining and pollution too, please. You'll be happy to know, Bridget Nomonde, if you open up the article they wrote in the Daily Maverick and some of the other articles that the Climate Justice Charter has put in the Daily Maverick, that's a really big focus. We want to end thirst, hunger, and pollution in South Africa as a big objective of the Climate Justice Charter. So on your side, Gabriel, any final thoughts before we allow people to brood on the kind of conversation we've had today?
Thank you, Tshiamo. Maybe just to say we all have a part to play in our different communities. Let's make sure we are not using the single-use plastics in our home. And when we use those, let's not dispose them in a way that would damage our biodiversity. When we also go out, let us be conscious of what footprint we make on the environment. And let each one of us play a role in our local areas, and we can make the difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Thank you so much, Francesca, for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Great to meet
you. Thank you to everybody who joined the...
I'd like to thank everyone in the audience who attended the webinar. Please do sign the petition for the Climate Justice Charter. It will be shared again in the chat. Do also follow us on social media. You can find CJ Charter SA on Twitter, COPAC SA on YouTube, and then Cooperative Policy and Alternative Center on Facebook. You can follow various platforms. You can also find the Climate Justice Charter on the website of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, safsc.org.za. And more than that, we're going to have our final webinar, the 6th one in this series, 2 weeks from now, to close off this entire series, which will be followed quite soon by an amazing podcast session, which you definitely want to catch if you want to hear this message again. And do get involved in the charter process online within your local community. And hopefully I get to see all of you again quite soon. Thank you so much for joining our webinar. And good night.
Thanks, Tshiamo. Thanks so much, Jane. Have a good one.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Tshiamo. Thank you, Francesca. Bye.
Thanks, Gabriel.
Thank
See you. Thanks, everyone.